The Georgia night was a living thing, thick and heavy, wrapping Savannah in a humid embrace that refused to let go even after the sun had slipped below the horizon. The summer heat lingered, a stubborn guest overstaying its welcome, making the air feel like a second skin. Denise Harris, 55, eased her battered 2009 Toyota Corolla into the parking lot of a suburban pharmacy, the neon sign above flickering like a dying star, casting jagged shadows across the cracked asphalt. Her bones ached, her muscles screamed from a 16-hour shift at St. Joseph's Hospital, where she'd spent the day stitching wounds, calming fevers, and holding hands through pain. 30 years as a nurse had carved lines into her face and strength into her soul, but tonight, unless she wanted was her bed, cool and quiet, and the blood pressure medication that kept her heart steady. Denise killed the engine, the Corolla's tired hum fading into the night's chorus of crickets and distant traffic. She sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her eyes gritty with exhaustion. The dashboard clock glowed 9:47 p.m. Her shift had started at 5 a.m., and the weight of it clung to her like the humidity unrelenting, suffocating. She thought of her mother, 82 and frail, waiting at home with a cup of chamomile tea and a worn-out copy of Pride and Prejudice. Denise had promised to be home by 10:30, but the pharmacy stop was non-negotiable. Without her meds, the headaches would creep in, then the dizziness, and she couldn't afford to miss a shift. Not with hospital bills piling up and her mother's care eating through her savings. She grabbed her purse, a sturdy black leather bag she bought at a thrift store a decade ago, and stepped out. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a rusted pickup truck and a sleek silver SUV gleaming under the lot's one working streetlight, its harsh glow flickering like it was fighting to stay alive. Denise's sneakers scuffed against the pavement as she walked toward the pharmacy's glass doors, her movements slow but deliberate, carrying the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime on her feet, serving others while the world barely noticed. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled into a loose bun, and her scrubs, faded blue and slightly wrinkled, hung loosely on her frame. She was tired, bone-tired, but she straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the day's weight drag her down. Inside, the pharmacy smelled of antiseptic and cheap air freshener, a sterile mix that stung her nose. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything: the scuffed linoleum floor, the cluttered aisles of cough syrups and Band-Aids, the faded posters advertising flu shots. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that made you hyper-aware of every sound. A teenage clerk, maybe 18, stood behind the counter, his acne-scarred face lit by the blue glow of his phone. He barely looked up as Denise approached, his thumbs tapping out a rhythm on the screen. She offered a tired smile, the kind that came automatically after years of diffusing tense patients and cranky doctors. "Evening," she said, her voice warm but worn, like a favorite sweater fraying at the edges. She slid her ID, insurance card, and prescription slip across the counter, the paper crinkling softly. "Just picking up my refill. Lisinopril 20 milligrams. The clerk, his name tag read. Tyler grunted something noncommittal and grabbed the documents, his eyes flicking over them with the enthusiasm of someone counting down the minutes to the end of his shift. He scanned her ID, then the prescription, his movements mechanical. Denise shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her arches throbbing. She glanced around, taking in the near-empty store. A woman in her 30s, juggling a toddler and a basket of diapers, rummaged through the baby aisle. An older man, his back hunched, studied a bottle of antacids like it held the secrets of the universe. And near the cold medicine, a young black man, early 20s, leaned against a shelf, scrolling on his phone. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans, his posture casual but alert, like someone who'd learned to keep one eye on the world at all times. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. Tyler's frown deepened as he stared at the computer screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He squinted, tapped a few keys, then leaned back and muttered something to himself. Denise's stomach tightened, a faint prickle of unease creeping up her spine. She'd been coming to this pharmacy for years, same meds, same insurance, same routine. Nothing ever took this long. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her tone even professional. She was used to staying calm, whether it was a patient crashing or a doctor barking orders. But Tyler didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and called over his shoulder. "Karen, can you take a look at this?" A woman emerged from behind a partition, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Karen, the manager, was in her mid-40s, with a pinched face and hair pulled into a severe bun that looked like it was punishing her scalp. Her name tag gleamed under the lights, and her eyes, cold, calculating, swept over Denise like she was sizing up a shoplifter. She stepped to the computer, her lips pursed, and tapped the screen with a manicured nail. She and Tyler exchanged hushed words, their voices too low for Denise to catch, but the tone was unmistakable, sharp, suspicious, like they were discussing something far worse than a prescription refill. Denise felt the air shift, a subtle but undeniable change, like the moment before a storm breaks. She knew this feeling, had felt it too many times in her life, the weight of eyes on her, the silent accusation that came before a single word was spoken. Every black person knew it, that invisible pressure, the way a room could turn against you without warning. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral, her hands steady at her sides. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Karen turned to her, her smile brittle, like cheap plastic about to snap. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "but there's an issue with your prescription. The account details don't match our records." Denise's brow furrowed, her exhaustion giving way to confusion. "That's not possible," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been picking up this same medication here for years. My ID, my insurance card, of everything's right there." She nodded toward the counter, where her documents sat untouched. Karen's hands twitched, her fingers fidgeting with a pen. "I'm afraid we can't process this tonight," she said, stepping back slightly, as if Denise might lunge at her. "The system's flagging it as a mismatch. It happens sometimes." Her eyes darted to Tyler, who was staring at his shoes like they were the most fascinating thing in the room. Denise leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Then check again. Run it through manually if you have to. I'm not leaving without my medication." Karen's chin lifted, her expression hardening. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait here. We've contacted the authorities to investigate." The word authorities hit like a slap. Denise blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Authorities?" she echoed, her voice dangerously low. "For a prescription I've had for a decade? You're calling the police over a computer glitch." Tyler shifted uncomfortably, his eyes still glued to the floor. Karen folded her arms, her posture rigid, her gaze unwavering. "It's standard procedure," she said, but her tone was smug, like she'd already decided Denise was guilty of something, anything. "We have to protect our customers." Denise took a slow breath, her years in emergency rooms kicking instinct calm. Stay focused, even when the walls start closing in. Her heart hammered, but her face remained a mask of composure. She could walk away, demand her papers back, and leave. But that would look like guilt, and Denise Harris had done nothing wrong. Not tonight, not ever. She planted her feet, her stance unyielding. "I'll wait," she said, her voice steady as granite. "But you're making a mistake." Across the store, the young man in the hoodie, Jamal, a 22-year-old community college student, had been watching, his phone quietly recording. He'd seen this play out before, felt the same sting of judgment in stores, on streets, in classrooms. His live stream, just a handful of viewers at first, captured Karen's smug expression, Tyler's nervous fidgeting, and Denise's calm defiance. The comment section was already lighting up. "What's going on? This is messed up." As his followers shared the video, the views ticking upward, 50, 100, 200. Jamal adjusted his angle, zooming in on Denise's face, her eyes burning with a quiet fury that spoke louder than any shout. He'd been in her shoes, profiled for no reason other than his skin, his presence. He wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to post a caption. "This is happening right now in Savannah. Share this. Justice for her." Back at the counter, the tension thickened, the air crackling with unspoken accusations. The woman with the toddler glanced over, her face a mix of curiosity and unease, then hurried her child toward the exit, as if trouble might spill over. The older man with the antacids lingered, his eyes flicking between Denise and Karen, his expression unreadable. Denise caught his gaze for a moment, searching for an ally, but he looked away, clutching his bottle like a shield. Karen tapped her foot, her impatience growing. "It won't be long," she said, but her tone suggested she was enjoying this, savoring the power of making Denise wait, of holding her fate in her hands. Tyler mumbled something about checking the system again, but his heart wasn't in it. He was just a kid, caught in the middle, but his silence felt like complicity. Denise's mind raced, piecing together the situation. A computer glitch was possible, systems failed all the time. But Karen's quick leap to calling the police, her refusal to double-check, her cold, judgmental stare wasn't about a glitch. It was about Denise, about the color of her skin, about the assumptions people like Karen carried like a second heartbeat. Denise had faced this before. The grocery store clerk who followed her through aisles, the security guard who demanded to check her bag, the patient's family who questioned her credentials despite her name tag and years of expertise. Each time she'd swallowed the humiliation, pushed forward, kept her head high. But tonight something in her stirred, a spark of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. She glanced at her watch, 10:02 p.m. Her mother would be worrying, her tea long gone cold. Denise's phone buzzed in her purse, a text from her neighbor, Miss Clara, checking if she was okay. "You home yet, sugar? Mama's asking for you." Denise didn't reply. She couldn't, not yet. Her focus was here on Karen on the counter, on the faint wail of sirens growing louder outside. The sirens sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to show it. She dealt with worse than this: gunshot victims bleeding out, families screaming in grief, nights when the ER felt like a war zone. She could handle a couple of cops, a smug manager, a system that didn't want her to win. But the stakes felt higher tonight, the injustice sharper, like a blade pressed against her skin. Jamal's live stream hit 500 viewers. The comments a furious blur: "This is racism. Call her a lawyer." And he added a caption, his fingers flying: "Black nurse being targeted at pharmacy. Savannah, Georgia spread the word." He glanced at Denise, their eyes meeting for a split second. She didn't know his name, didn't know he was streaming, but she saw something in his gaze: solidarity, anger, a shared understanding of what it meant to be seen as a threat for existing. The pharmacy's door swung open, and a gust of warm night air swept in, carrying the scent of asphalt and magnolias. The sirens were close now, their wail piercing the quiet. Denise's pulse thudded in her ears, but she stood taller, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She wasn't just a nurse tonight, not just a daughter or a caregiver. She was a woman who'd had enough, who'd spent a lifetime proving her worth to a world that refused to see it. And she wasn't about to let Karen or the police or anyone else write her story for her. The first officer stepped through the doors, his boots heavy, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Nathan Coleman, 42, broad-chested and square-jawed, with a buzz cut and a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his face. Behind him was Eric Miller, 29, thinner, younger, his eyes darting nervously, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be here. Coleman's gaze locked on Denise, and she felt the same judgment she'd seen in Karen's eyes, the same assumption that she was trouble, that she didn't belong. "Ma'am," Coleman said, his voice thick with condescension, "we need you to step outside." Denise didn't move. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her words clear, deliberate. She held up her documents, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "This is my ID, my insurance, my prescription. Check them." Coleman didn't even glance at the papers. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, inches from his holster. "I said step outside." Karen rushed forward, her voice dropping into a fake humble whisper. "That's her," she hissed, pointing at Denise. She tried to use fraudulent documents. "The accounts don't match." Jamal's phone stayed steady, his live stream now at 1,000 viewers, the comments a roaring chorus of outrage. He zoomed in on Coleman's sneer, on Denise's unwavering stance, on Karen's triumphant smirk. The video was spreading, shared across X, picked up by local activists, even catching the eye of a news producer working late. This wasn't just a pharmacy anymore. It was a stage, and the world was starting to watch. Denise met Coleman's gaze, her eyes burning with a fire she hadn't felt in years. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low, steady, a warning wrapped in calm. "A big one." Coleman's sneer widened, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his armor. He didn't know it yet, but he was stepping into a fight he couldn't win. And Denise Harris, tired, aching and unbreakable, was ready to show him exactly who he was dealing with. The pharmacy's glass doors burst open with a force that rattled the metal frames, and a gust of humid Georgia air swept in, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and impending rain. Nathan Coleman, 42, strode into the fluorescent-lit store like he owned it, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his buzz cut catching the harsh light. His eyes, cold and predatory, locked onto Denise Harris with the certainty of a hunter spotting prey. Behind him, Eric Miller, 29, followed, his thinner frame almost swallowed by Coleman's shadow. Miller's gaze darted nervously, his hands twitching at his sides, like a rookie unsure if he was ready for the game he'd been dragged into. The air crackled with tension, the kind that made your skin prickle, and Denise, standing firm at the counter, felt it like a storm about to break. Coleman's boots thudded against the scuffed linoleum, each step deliberate, commanding attention. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with condescension, dripping like molasses over broken glass. We need you to step outside. Denise didn't flinch. Her purse hung heavy on her shoulder. Her faded blue scrubs a quiet testament to the 16-hour shift she'd just endured. At 55, she'd seen enough gunshot wounds, grieving families, nights when the air felt like a battlefield to know how to keep her composure. She held up her documents: ID, insurance card, prescription slide, her hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. I haven't done anything wrong, she said. Her words clear, measured, cutting through the room's stifling air. This is my ID, my insurance, my prescription. Check them. Coleman didn't even glance at the papers. His sneer widened, a cruel curve that said he'd already made up his mind. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, inches from his holster, the gesture a silent threat. I said, step outside. Karen, the pharmacy manager, rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically. Her pinched face glowed with a mix of relief and triumph, as if Coleman's arrival validated every suspicion she'd harbored. That's her, she hissed, pointing at Denise with a manicured finger. She tried to use fraudulent documents. The accounts don't match. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but it carried sharp and accusing, meant for everyone in the store to hear. Across the aisle, Jamal, the 22-year-old community college student, kept his phone steady, his live stream now at 2,000 viewers and climbing. The comment section was a wildfire. This is straight-up racism. She's just trying to get her meds. As his followers shared the video across X, the views ticking up like a heartbeat. 2,500, 3,000, 4,000. Jamal zoomed in on Coleman's aggressive stance, on Denise's unwavering calm, on Karen's smug satisfaction. He'd seen this script before, lived it himself, profiled at a gas station, followed in a mall, stopped for looking suspicious while walking home. His thumb hovered over the screen, adding a new caption. Savannah PD targeting a black nurse. This is happening now. Justice for her. Denise's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of steel. She knew what was coming, had felt the edges of this moment in 1,000 small slights over her lifetime. The clerk who clutched her purse tighter, the neighbor who crossed the street, the patient who questioned her credentials despite her name tag and 30 years of experience. But this was different, sharper, a blade pressed against her dignity. She could feel the eyes of the other customers, the woman with the toddler, now frozen near the exit, the older man clutching his antacids, his gaze flickering with unease, a teenage girl in the candy aisle, her phone out, recording her own shaky video. And Jamal, his quiet defiance, a lifeline she didn't yet know she had. I'm not going anywhere until you check my papers, Denise said, her voice low but unyielding, each word a challenge. She held Coleman's gaze, her dark eyes burning with a fire forged in decades of resilience. You want to make a scene? Go ahead. But I'm not the one who's going to look guilty. Coleman's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under his stubble. He wasn't used to this, someone standing their ground, refusing to shrink under his badge's weight. Most people folded, cowed by the uniform, the authority, the unspoken threat of what he could do. But Denise Harris wasn't most people. She was a nurse who'd held dying hands, a daughter who'd carried her family through loss, a woman who'd built a life brick by brick in a world that often tried to tear it down. And tonight she was done bending. Karen folded her arms, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk. You heard the officer, she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. The burly man in the flannel shirt, who'd been lingering near the vitamins, stepped forward, his face red with indignation. This is ridiculous, he barked, his voice booming in the quiet store. She's just trying to get her medicine. You're calling the cops over a computer error. His hands clenched into fists, his stance protective, like he was ready to shield Denise from the absurdity unfolding. Coleman whirled on him, his eyes narrowing. Back off, sir, he snapped, his hand moving closer to his holster. Unless you want to join her in cuffs. The man hesitated, his courage faltering under Coleman's glare, but he didn't back down completely. This ain't right, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Y'all know it ain't right. Jamal's live stream captured it all, the man's defiance, Coleman's threat, Denise's steady resolve. The views hit 10,000 and the comments exploded. Somebody call a lawyer. This is Savannah PD's MO. As the video spread beyond local followers to activists, journalists, and ordinary people scrolling late at night, a news van from WSAV, alerted by a producer monitoring X, was already en route, its headlights cutting through the humid darkness. Denise felt the room tilting, the weight of every stare pressing against her. She could walk away, demand her papers back, and leave. But that would be admitting defeat, letting them paint her as guilty. And Denise Harris didn't run. Not from patients coding in the ER, not from bills piling up, not from a system that expected her to bow. She planted her feet, her shoulders squared, and waited. Coleman stepped closer, his breath hot and sour, his voice dropping to a low growl. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, the threat no longer veiled. His hand closed around her wrist, rough and unyielding, twisting it behind her back. Denise winced, a sharp pain shooting up her arm, but she didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him that. Gasps rippled through the store. The woman with the toddler clutched her child and hurried out, her eyes wide with fear. The older man with the antacid shook his head, muttering under his breath, but stayed rooted, too stunned to move. The teenage girl's phone trembled in her hands, her video blurry but damning. And Jamal, his heart pounding, kept filming, his live stream now at 15,000 viewers, the comment section a storm of outrage and calls to action. Coleman snapped the handcuffs around Denise's wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin, the click echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. "Let's go," he barked, yanking her toward the door. Denise stumbled, her sneakers catching on the linoleum, but she caught herself, her head held high. She wouldn't let them see her break. Karen watched, her arms still folded, her smirk widening into something almost gleeful. "Told you she was trouble," she whispered to Tyler, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. The clerk's face was pale, his hands shaking as he pretended to busy himself with the computer, but his eyes kept darting to Denise, guilt flickering in them. As Coleman dragged Denise toward the exit, Jamal followed, his phone still rolling. He stayed a few steps back, careful not to draw attention, but his presence was a silent rebellion, a refusal to let this moment disappear into the night. Denise caught his eye for a fleeting second, a spark of connection passing between them, two strangers bound by the same fight, the same pain, the same refusal to be silenced. Outside, the humid air hit like a wall, the sirens now silent as the squad car idled in the lot, its red and blue lights painting the asphalt in eerie pulses. The crowd was small but growing, a handful of locals who'd seen Jamal's live stream, a couple of teenagers on bikes, a woman in pajamas who'd rushed over from a nearby apartment complex. They held up phones, some recording, others shouting questions. What did she do? Why is she in cuffs? The questions hung unanswered, swallowed by the night. Coleman shoved Denise toward the squad car, his grip bruising, his patience gone. "Get in," he growled, opening the back door. Denise moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to be rushed. She slid into the seat, the worn vinyl creaking under her weight, the cuffs digging deeper into her wrists. The door slammed shut, the sound final like a cell locking. But before Coleman could climb into the driver's seat, his radio crackled, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the static. "Unit 12, we've got a 10-31 in progress, armed robbery at the gas station on Abercorn, 3 blocks out. Suspect is male, 30s, armed with a knife. Requesting immediate response." Denise's breath caught. She knew that code 10-31 meant a crime in progress, urgent, dangerous. She watched Coleman's face through the rearview mirror, waiting for him to react, to do his job. But he didn't. He muted the radio, his jaw clenching, and turned to Miller, who was hovering near the passenger door, his face pale. "Let's make an example out of her," Coleman said, his voice low, meant only for Miller but loud enough for Denise to hear. "These people think they can walk in, take what they want, lie to our faces. Not tonight." Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to Denise, then away. "Shouldn't we, take the call?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Coleman's head snapped toward him, his glare venomous. "You questioning me, rookie?" Miller shrank back, his shoulders hunching, his silence a surrender. Denise's blood boiled, the injustice searing through her. A robbery was happening, people could be hurt, and this man, this officer sworn to protect, was ignoring it to punish her for nothing. She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the cuffs, the humiliation, the rage. "You're digging your own grave," she said, her words slicing through the car's stifling air. "Both of you." Coleman's eyes met hers in the mirror, a flash of unease crossing his face before his sneer returned. "Big talk for someone in cuffs," he said, but his voice wavered just for a second. He started the engine, the car rumbling to life, and pulled out of the lot, leaving the growing crowd and Jamal's camera behind. The ride to the precinct was a blur of flashing lights and suffocating silence. Denise sat stiffly, the cuffs cutting into her skin, the squad car stale air smelling of sweat and cheap air freshener. She stared out the window, Savannah streets blurring past neon signs, oak trees draped in Spanish moss, the quiet beauty of a city that hid its ugliness well. Her mind raced, piecing together the night's events, the absurdity of it all. A computer glitch, a manager's bias, a cop's ego, and now she was here, caged in the back of a squad car like a criminal. Coleman and Miller talked in low voices, their words casual, dismissive, like she wasn't even there. Another fraud case, Coleman said, chuckling. What is it with these people, thinking they can just walk in and scam the system? Miller mumbled something vague, his tone uncertain, but he didn't disagree. Denise's jaw clenched, her nails digging into her palms. These people? The phrase stung, not because it was new, but because it was so old, so familiar, a tired script she'd heard her whole life. She wanted to scream, to demand they see her Denise Harris, nurse, daughter, survivor, not the caricature they'd already drawn. But she stayed silent, knowing words wouldn't change their minds. Not yet. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat, concrete building with flickering lights and a faded sign, Savannah Police Department. Coleman yanked the car into the lot, the tires squealing, and killed the engine. He opened the back door with an impatient flick of his wrist. Let's go, he said, motioning Denise out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She climbed out carefully, the cuffs making every movement awkward, the eyes of other officers in the lot burning into her. A few stood near their cruisers, sipping coffee, pretending not to notice, but their curiosity was palpable, a weight on her back. Inside, the precinct was a maze of scuffed floors and peeling paint, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a harsh glare that made everyone look guilty. They led her to the booking desk, where a desk sergeant, a balding man with heavy jowls, glanced up from his paperwork. Miller fumbled with the cuffs, his hands shaking slightly, while Coleman filled out a form, his pen scratching lazily. Name, Denise Harris, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Age, 55. Race, black. The last word landed like a verdict, and Denise's stomach twisted. That box, she thought bitterly, was the only one they'd cared about tonight. The sergeant gave her a cursory glance, then shrugged, as if this was just another night, another arrest, another black woman to process. Coleman smirked, pushing the form across the desk. Suspected prescription fraud, he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. Caught red-handed at the pharmacy. The booking process was a slow, deliberate humiliation. They took her mugshot, the flash blinding, the click of the camera like a door slamming shut. They fingerprinted her, pressing her sore wrist against the ink pad, rolling each finger with mechanical precision, as if she was already convicted. Denise stood tall, her face impassive, refusing to let them see the anger simmering beneath her calm. But inside, she was raging not just at Coleman Minor, not just at Coleman and Miller, but at the system that let them thrive, the world that turned a blind eye. They led her to a holding cell, a bare, cold room with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a single flickering bulb overhead. The door slammed shut, the clang echoing down the hallway, a sound that felt like it could shatter bone. Coleman leaned against the bars, his smirk intact. You want to tell us the real story now? He asked, his voice mocking. Might go easier if you come clean. Denise met his gaze, unflinching. The real story is you're going to regret this, she said, her voice steady as steel. Miller snorted from the hallway, leaning against the wall. Yeah, right. Got a magic lawyer in that purse of yours. But his bravado was thin, his eyes avoiding hers. Coleman shrugged, unfazed. Suit yourself. You can sit here and think about it. They walked away, their boots thudding, leaving her alone with the buzzing light and the smell of bleach and defeat. But Denise wasn't defeated. She sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing slow, measured. She turned her wrists, studying the red welts the cuffs had left evidence, not just of tonight, but of a lifetime of battles fought and won. Outside, she could hear voices, faint but growing louder, a crowd gathering, chanting her name. Jamal's video was spreading, the truth breaking free, and somewhere, her father, Malcolm Harris, was already moving, a storm of his own brewing. The clock above the booking desk ticked loudly. 10:32 p.m. It wouldn't be long now. Denise leaned back against the cold concrete wall, her eyes closing for a moment, a small fierce smile tugging at her lips. They thought they'd broken her. They thought she was alone. They had no idea what was coming. The Savannah Police Department precinct was a fortress of concrete and flickering lights, but tonight, it felt like a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale coffee and disinfectant, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing like a swarm of angry wasps. Denise Harris sat on the cold metal bench in her holding cell, her wrists throbbing from the handcuffs that had bitten into her skin just hours ago. At 55, she was exhausted bone deep, soul weary, but her spine was straight, her dark eyes burning with a quiet defiance that refused to be extinguished. The clock above the booking desk ticked loudly. 10:42 p.m. She could hear the faint murmur of voices outside, growing louder, angrier. A crowd gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Jamal's live stream, now viral, had done its work, and Savannah was waking up. Inside the cell, Denise's thoughts churned. She replayed the night's events: the pharmacy, Karen's smug accusation, Nathan Coleman's sneer, the cold snap of cuffs around her wrists. She thought of her mother, alone at home worrying, her chamomile tea gone cold. She thought of her patients, the ones she'd fought for through pandemics and late-night emergencies, and the bitter irony of being treated like a criminal after a lifetime of saving lives. But beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, a small flame burned steady and fierce. They thought they could silence her, erase her dignity with a badge and a lie. They were wrong. The precinct's front door banged open, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the hallway. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that comes when the air shifts, when power moves from one hand to another. Denise didn't need to see who'd walked in to know. She felt the weight of a presence that filled the space, unyielding, unstoppable. Her father, Malcolm Harris, 78, had arrived, and the storm he brought with him was about to tear through everything. Malcolm Harris stepped into the precinct like a force of nature, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his tailored suit crisp despite the late hour. At 78, he carried himself with the authority of a man who'd spent decades dismantling corruption, a retired FBI special agent whose name still made law enforcement brass sit up straighter. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Flanking him were two federal agents, their dark suits and earpieces marking them as the real deal, not local cops, not rent-a-guards, but men who answered to Washington. Their faces were stone, their movements precise, and their presence sent a ripple of unease through the precinct. The desk sergeant, a balding man with sweat beading on his forehead, froze mid-sentence, his pen hovering over a report. Officers who'd been joking moments ago fell silent, their coffee cups forgotten, their eyes darting to Malcolm like deer sensing a predator. Nathan Coleman, leaning against a wall near the holding cells, straightened up, his sneer faltering for the first time that night. Eric Miller, hovering nearby, looked like he wanted to disappear into the linoleum, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Malcolm's gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate, taking in every detail: the scuffed floors, the flickering lights, the nervous faces. Then his eyes found Denise, locked in her cell, and 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "I'm here. You're not alone." She gave the smallest nod, her lips pressing into a tight line, her strength mirrored in his resolve. Malcolm turned to the sergeant, his voice calm but lethal, each word landing like a hammer on an anvil. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his tone carrying the weight of a man who expected answers and wouldn't settle for excuses. The sergeant stammered, his jowls trembling. That'd be me, sir. Sergeant Daniels." Malcolm stepped closer, his presence shrinking the room. "Good. Then you'll explain why a licensed nurse with no criminal record is sitting in a holding cell tonight. Explain why your officers detained her without verifying her identity. Explain why they physically restrained her in public without probable cause." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes flicked to Coleman, then away, as if seeking rescue from a sinking ship. Coleman stepped forward, his chest puffed out, his bravado a thin mask over growing panic. "She was uncooperative, sir," he said, his voice loud but unsteady. "Suspected prescription fraud. We followed protocol." Malcolm turned his head slowly, fixing Coleman with a look that could freeze fire. "Protocol?" he repeated, his voice low, dangerous. "I have a video that says otherwise. And so does half of Savannah by now." Coleman's face drained of color, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. He'd underestimated this moment, underestimated Denise, underestimated the man standing before him. Jamal's live stream, now at 100,000 viewers, had spread like wildfire across X, shared by activists, journalists, and everyday people enraged by the footage of a black nurse cuffed for no reason. A WSAV News van was parked outside, its camera rolling, and a crowd of dozens locals, students, neighbor chanted Denise's name, their signs bobbing in the humid night air. "Free Denise. No justice, no peace." Malcolm dropped a bombshell, his voice steady but cutting. "I've been tracking your record, Officer Coleman. 15 excessive force complaints, 7 allegations of racial profiling, 3 internal affairs investigations all buried by your department. Care to explain that?" The precinct went deathly quiet, the only sound the buzz of the lights and the faint roar of the crowd outside. Coleman's fists clenched at his sides, his face turning an angry red, but he said nothing. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glued to the floor, his silence a confession of its own. Daniels wiped sweat from his brow, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his paperwork. Malcolm continued, his words relentless. "As of 30 minutes ago, this precinct is under federal review for multiple violations of constitutional and civil rights. The Department of Justice is on the line, and they're not happy." He nodded to the agents beside him, one of whom produced a set of keys and moved toward Denise's cell. Coleman found his voice, his tone desperate, defiant. "You can't just walk in here," and he started, but Malcolm cut him off with a single raised hand, the gesture as final as a judge's gavel. "I already have," Malcolm said, his voice calm but unyielding. The cell door swung open with a soft metallic creak, and Denise rose slowly, every movement deliberate, every muscle screaming for dignity. She didn't reach for Malcolm right away. Instead, she stood on her own, her back straight, her shoulders squared, her gaze sweeping the room. Coleman, Miller, Daniels, the other officers who'd watched her humiliation like it was entertainment. She held their eyes, forcing them to see her, to feel the weight of what they'd done. Malcolm offered his hand, a quiet gesture of support, and Denise nodded once, a small, fierce smile tugging at her lips. She stepped out of the cell, her sneakers soft against the linoleum, and walked past Coleman without sparing him a glance. But she saw the way his hands fisted, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew finally that this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The precinct's phones rang relentlessly, a cacophony of demand reporters seeking comment, activists organizing protests, a senator's aide inquiring about the incident, now trending nationwide. The federal agents moved with precision, one accessing the precinct's computer system, the other pulling files from a locked cabinet. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to dismantle. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100, their chants shaking the precinct's walls. A young woman with a megaphone led the call in response. "What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now." Jamal stood at the edge, his phone still streaming, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination. His video had caught the eye of a national news producer, and CNN was already planning a segment. Hashtags like Justice for Denise and Savannah PD trended on X, with thousands of posts dissecting the footage, sharing stories of similar injustices, demanding accountability. Inside, the tension was a living thing, wrapping around the officers like a chokehold. Daniel sagged behind the desk, his fight draining out of him. Miller slumped against a wall, chewing his thumbnail until it bled, his eyes darting to the exit like he might bolt. Coleman paced, his boots thudding, his face a storm of fury and fear. He stopped outside Denise's now empty cell, his hands gripping the bars, his knuckles white. "This is getting blown out of proportion," he snapped to no one in particular. She resisted. She made it complicated. No one responded. Even Miller stayed silent, his cowardice pinning him in place. Deep down, they all knew the truth. Denise hadn't resisted, hadn't shouted, hadn't fought. She'd stood there, tired and dignified, while they shoved her into cuffs and paraded her through a pharmacy like a trophy. And now, every second that passed, the evidence of that injustice was multiplying. Jamal's video, witness statements, the crowd's growing rage. Malcolm turned to Daniels, his voice low but commanding. "You'll turn over all body cam footage from tonight. Every second, no edits, no gaps." Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone, but a look from one of the agents, a woman with sharp eyes and a tighter jaw, made him comply. He fumbled for the login credentials, his fingers slipping on the keys. Coleman took a step forward, his voice rising. "You can't seize our footage without a warrant," he barked, his bravado a desperate attempt to regain control. The female agent turned, her gaze cold and unarguable. "You waived that right the second you initiated an arrest without probable cause," she said, her voice low but cutting. "Congratulations." Across the room, the other agent plugged a device into the precinct's main server, pulling up files faster than anyone could stop him. Miller made a small, choked noise, but stayed where he was, paralyzed by the weight of his own mistakes. Coleman's chest heaved, his hands twitching like he didn't know whether to fight or flee. The agent's tablet lit up with body cam footage, the screen casting a damning glow. The video played in silent clarity, Denise handing over her ID, calmly explaining herself, standing still as Coleman sneered, mocked, manhandled her. No resistance, no aggression, just a woman asserting her rights in the face of cruelty. The agent paused the video, turning the tablet to face the room. "This," she said simply, "is what happens when you think no one's watching." No one spoke. No one moved. Denise's voice echoed from the tablet, captured by Coleman's body cam. "You're digging your own grave." The agent smiled thinly. "Turns out," she said, "she was right." Malcolm stood at the center of it all, his arms folded, his jaw tight. He didn't look triumphant, didn't gloat. He looked furious, a controlled fury that burned slow and lasted a lifetime. He'd seen this too many times, officers hiding behind badges, systems protecting the guilty, communities left to pick up the pieces. But tonight the script was changing and he was writing the new ending. The precinct door burst open again, and a new figure stormed in, a local activist named Tasha Reynolds, 34, her braids swinging, her eyes blazing. She'd seen Jamal's video while scrolling X at home, and within an hour, she'd rallied dozens to the precinct, her megaphone now passed to a colleague outside. She marched to the desk, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not leaving until Denise Harris walks out free," she said, her words aimed at Daniels but loud enough for the crowd to hear. The cheers outside roared louder, shaking the windows. Daniels raised his hands, his voice trembling. "We're handling it, ma'am. Please stay calm." "Calm?" Tasha snapped, her laugh sharp and bitter. "You want calm when you've got a nurse in cuffs for picking up her meds? You want calm when your officers are out here brutalizing black women? Try again." The crowd's chants grew deafening, their signs pressing against the glass doors. A news camera caught Tasha's words, broadcasting them live to thousands watching at home. Malcolm gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. Tasha returned it, her resolve unwavering. Denise stood near Malcolm now, her wrists still red from the cuffs, her scrubs rumpled but her dignity intact. She watched the chaos unfold, agents pulling files, officers scrambling, Tasha's defiance, the crowd's roar, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd been profiled, every voice silenced, every injustice swept under the rug. She was tired, yes, but she was also awake, alive with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. A phone rang at the desk, sharp and insistent. Daniels picked it up, his face paling as he listened. "Yes, sir," he croaked, nodding frantically. "Right away, sir." He held the phone out to Malcolm, his hand trembling. It's for you." Malcolm took the receiver with a calm that couldn't be faked, his expression unchanged. "This is Harris," he said simply. A beat of silence, then a small cold smile crossed his face. "Good. Proceed." He hung up without another word, handing the phone back to Daniels like it was a prop in a play he was directing. Denise raised an eyebrow, her voice low enough for only Malcolm to hear. "What was that?" Malcolm leaned in slightly, his words meant for her alone. "The civil rights unit I helped build before I retired," he said. "They've been waiting for a case to make an example of. Looks like they just found it." Before Denise could respond, the door swung open again, and more federal agents entered, 6 of them, moving with the precision of a SWAT team. They spread through the precinct, some heading to the offices, others accessing computers, pulling files with a speed that left the officers stunned. One agent handed a thick folder to Daniels, who took it like it might explode. "This station," the agent said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "is now under immediate federal audit pending civil rights violations." A gasp rippled through the room. Coleman took a half step forward, his face darkening. "This is a local matter," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain. Malcolm turned, his voice almost amused. "You should read the fine print on your badge, officer," he said. "Local authority doesn't override federal law." An agent stepped into Coleman's path, blocking him with a look that brooked no argument. Denise felt the room shift again, the weight lifting, replaced by an electric charge, the realization that the system these officers had relied on was turning against them. Malcolm motioned for her to follow him toward the exit. They didn't rush, didn't need to. Each step was a message: we are not powerless. We are not invisible. And you will answer for what you've done. As they reached the door, Denise paused, turning back for a moment. Not to gloat, not to mock, but to let her gaze sweep across the faces staring at her. Coleman's fury, Miller's fear, Daniels' defeat, the other officers' stunned silence. She held their eyes, her presence a quiet rebuke. Then she turned and stepped into the humid Georgia night, free. The air outside was sharp, alive with the scent of rain and the roar of the crowd. Over 100 strong now, they erupted into cheers as Denise appeared, their signs waving, their phones capturing every second. Tasha rushed forward, her eyes shining. "You're out," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've got your back." Denise nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but heavy with meaning. Malcolm stood beside her, silent, his presence a wall of strength. A news camera zoomed in, the reporters shouting questions, but Denise ignored them. She looked at the crowd, students, parents, strangers united by a single video, a single injustice, and felt the weight of their hope, their anger, their belief in her. Coleman watched from inside, his hands pressed against the glass, his face a mask of rage. He tried to cover his tracks, leaking a false report claiming Denise had resisted arrest. But Jamal's unedited video, now on every news channel, had exposed the lie, frame by frame. X was ablaze with calls for his badge, his arrest, his head. The precinct was a sinking ship, and Coleman was drowning. Malcolm's phone buzzed, and he checked the screen, a grunt of satisfaction escaping him. "What is it?" Denise asked. He looked up, his eyes gleaming under the streetlights. "Background checks," he said. "Turns out Coleman and Miller have skeletons rattling around, buried complaints, tampered evidence, favors for connected friends." "Not anymore." Denise shook her head, a humorless smile tugging at her lips. "They thought they could make me disappear." Malcolm's face hardened. "They thought you were alone." He opened the car door for her, and as she slid into the passenger seat, she realized how strange it felt to be free, to breathe without cuffs, without concrete walls pressing in. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time that night, she felt the tide turning. As Malcolm started the engine, the crowd's chants followed them into the night. "Justice for Denise! Justice for Denise!" The precinct's lights burned behind them, but the old rule, the ones that said people like her had to accept whatever was done to them, were flickering, fading. And tonight, something new was rising, something unstoppable. The federal courthouse in Savannah stood like a monument to order, its marble floors gleaming under the spring sunlight that poured through tall windows. The air inside was heavy, charged with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel like it carried the weight of history. Denise Harris, 55, sat in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her faded blue scrubs replaced by a simple navy dress that hugged her frame with quiet dignity. Her wrists, still faintly scarred from the handcuffs that had bound her months ago, were a silent reminder of the night that had changed everything. At her side, her father, Malcolm Harris, 78, sat tall, his silver hair catching the light, his face carved with the stern resolve of a man who'd spent a lifetime fighting for justice. The courtroom was packed, reporters, activists, locals, all craning their necks to witness the final act of a drama that had gripped the city for nearly a year. At the defense table, Nathan Coleman and Eric Miller sat stiffly, their suits wrinkled, their faces pale, stripped of the arrogance that had defined them. Coleman, 42, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table like it might anchor him against the tide of consequences. Miller, 29, looked smaller, diminished, his eyes hollow, his fingers twitching nervously. Gone were the sneers, the swagger, the certainty that their badges would shield them. They were men now, not officers, and the truth had caught up, relentless and unforgiving. Denise's gaze was steady, her heart a quiet drumbeat of resolve. She wasn't here for revenge, wasn't here to gloat. She was here for accountability for the countless others who'd never had a Malcolm Harris to call, a viral video to amplify their cries, a courtroom to hear their truth. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, their steps slow and deliberate. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, rose, clutching the verdict slip in trembling hands. The room held its breath. On the charge of obstruction of justice, she read, her voice steady but loud in the silence, "We find the defendants guilty." A murmur rippled through the gallery, soft but electric. Denise's fingers tightened in her lap, but her face remained calm, a mask of strength. On the charge of falsifying police reports, the foreman continued, "Guilty." On the charge of unlawful arrest and deprivation of civil rights under color of law, "Guilty." The words landed like hammer blows, each one heavier than the last. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." The syllables echoed off the marble walls, settling into the corners of the room like dust. Coleman slumped forward, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Miller stared blankly, his eyes unfocused, a man already broken. Neither dared look at Denise, at the woman whose quiet defiance had unraveled their world. The judge, a stern woman with gray-streaked hair, thanked the jury and adjourned the court, her gavel a sharp crack that signaled the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. People stirred, gathering papers, whispering among themselves, but Denise stayed rooted, letting the moment wash over her. She didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel vengeful. She felt to read a good kind of tired, the kind that came after a long, brutal fight, where you'd left everything on the field and walked away standing. Malcolm touched her elbow gently, his voice low and warm. "You ready to go home?" Denise nodded, her throat tight. They rose together, moving through the crowded gallery, past reporters shouting questions, past cameras flashing like lightning. Outside, the air was cool and sweet, touched with the first hints of spring. Azaleas bloomed along the sidewalks, their bright pinks and whites defiant against the backdrop of old brick buildings. Denise took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean, heavy air. Freedom smelled different today, sharper, more precious, earned. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Tasha Reynolds, the activist who'd rallied the crowd that night at the precinct, waited with a broad smile, her braids catching the sunlight. "You did it," she said simply, her voice thick with pride. Denise shook her head, her smile small but genuine. "We did it." Malcolm clapped Tasha on the shoulder, and the three stood for a moment, savoring the victory, the crack in the system they'd forced open. It wasn't perfect, wasn't complete, but it was enough to start. Malcolm's phone buzzed, another call from a community leader seeking advice, but he silenced it with a swipe of his thumb. Today wasn't about work. Today was about breathing. The trial had been the culmination of months of relentless effort. The Department of Justice had torn through the Savannah Police Department like a scalpel, exposing a cesspool of corruption. 15 excessive force complaints against Coleman, 7 allegations of racial profiling, 3 internal affairs investigations, all buried by a department more interested in protecting its own than serving its people. Emails surfaced, vile exchanges between Coleman and Miller bragging about rough arrests, joking about teaching lessons. Screenshots showed evidence tampering, chain of custody violations, cases where body cam footage had mysteriously vanished. But it hadn't vanished, not entirely. A whistleblower, a young IT technician fed up with the cover-ups, had saved backups, and now every damning second played out on DOJ monitors, viewed by agents building a case that would end careers. One clip haunted Denise, a black teenager, barely 16, pinned against a patrol car, sobbing as Coleman barked insults. No crime, no justification, just cruelty with a badge. Another showed Miller shoving a Latina woman into a squad car for questioning a traffic stop, her voice trembling, her hands raised in surrender. Each video chipped away at the department's defenses, leaving no room for spin, no plausible deniability. The truth was there, raw and undeniable, and it burned. The fallout had been swift. The police chief resigned quietly, slipping away in the dead of night, no press conference, no farewell. Half a dozen senior officers were suspended, their names tied to buried complaints. The mayor, his re-election campaign crumbling under public pressure, announced he wouldn't run again, citing health reasons no one believed. And Savannah changed slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. New policies rolled out, mandatory racial bias training, stricter body cam protocols, a civilian oversight board with real teeth. A federal monitor was appointed, their presence a constant reminder that the old ways wouldn't survive. Denise became a reluctant symbol, her face splashed across news channels, her story a rallying cry. She didn't want the spotlight, didn't crave the interviews or the applause. But when Tasha and other activists asked her to speak at a rally, she couldn't say no. Not when she thought of that teenager, that woman, the countless others who'd suffered in silence. She stood before a crowd of thousands in Forsyth Park, her voice steady, her words cutting through the humid air. "I'm not special," she said, her eyes sweeping the sea of faces. "I'm just the one who got seen. But there are thousands more, and they deserve justice, too." The crowd roared, their signs waving justice for Denise. Justice for all, and Denise felt the weight of their hope, their anger, their belief in her. She stepped off the stage, her legs trembling, and Tasha pulled her into a fierce hug. "You're changing things," Tasha whispered. "You're making them listen." Denise led a class action lawsuit, filed with dozens of plaintiffs, men, women, teenagers, seniors, all with stories of humiliation and brutality at the hands of Savannah PD. The legal team, headed by Marcus Dean, a civil rights attorney with a fire in his belly, demanded accountability, reparations, and federal oversight. The city fought back at first, hiring high-priced lawyers, issuing statements about isolated incidents. But the evidence was overwhelming: videos, emails, witness testimonies, and public pressure was relentless. National media descended, CNN and MSNBC running nightly segments, even Fox News unable to ignore the story. The lawsuit settled for millions, the funds earmarked for victims and community programs, a small step toward healing a fractured city. The movement spread beyond Savannah. Community organizers in Atlanta, Charleston, and Birmingham reached out, seeking advice, sharing their own stories. Whistleblowers in other departments came forward, inspired by the IT technicians' courage. Denise and Malcolm became consultants of sorts, their phone lines buzzing with calls from activists and attorneys building their own cases. What had started as one arrest, one injustice, had become a blueprint, a roadmap for dismantling corruption from the inside out. One evening, Denise sat with Malcolm on the back porch of her modest shotgun house, the crickets chirping in the warm Georgia air. The sky was painted deep purple and gold, the last scraps of sunlight fading over the horizon. She sipped sweet tea, the ice clinking softly, and let the quiet settle over them. Her mother, now frilier but still sharp, dozed inside, her book open on her lap. The world felt softer tonight, gentler, like it was holding its breath. "You ever think we'd see something like this?" Denise asked, her voice low, almost reverent. Malcolm chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Not in my lifetime," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the stars emerging one by one. "Hell, not even in my dreams some days." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Denise thought back to that night in the pharmacy, Karen's sneer, Coleman's grip, the cold bite of cuffs. She thought of the cell, the crowd, the video that had turned a private humiliation into a public reckoning. And she thought of the people who'd stood with her, Tasha, Jamal, Marcus, strangers who'd become allies. A city that had finally started to listen. "It's not over, is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm shook his head, his gaze steady. "No, it never is. There's always another fight, another battle." He turned to her, his eyes fierce with pride. "But you made them see, Denise. You made them care." She smiled, a real one, tired but full of something deeper, hope, not the blind kind, but the hard-earned kind that grew from scars and struggle. Her phone buzzed on the table, another reporter, another rally organizer, but she let it go to voicemail. Tonight, she wasn't a symbol, wasn't a fighter. She was just Denise, a nurse, a daughter, a woman who'd refused to be defined by what they'd done to her. The weeks that followed were a blur of progress and pushback. Savannah's new police leadership, under an interim chief who spoke of reform with cautious optimism, faced resistance from old guard officers loyal to the way things were. Protests flared up again when a leaked memo revealed attempts to undermine the Civilian Oversight Board, but Tasha and her network were ready, organizing marches that shut down Bay Street. Denise spoke at one, her voice stronger now, her words a call to keep fighting. "Change doesn't come easy," she said, "but it comes if we don't stop." The lawsuit's impact rippled outward, inspiring similar cases in other cities. A coalition of activists formed, linking Savannah's fight to a national movement for police reform. Denise became a reluctant mentor, guiding victims through the legal maze, her hospital shifts now balanced with late-night strategy calls. She dreamed of a vacation, maybe a quiet beach somewhere, where she could walk barefoot and forget the weight of the world, but she knew it would wait. The work was too urgent, the stakes too high. One afternoon, Denise visited a community center funded by the lawsuit settlement, a bright, airy space where kids painted murals and seniors shared stories. A teenager, a girl with braids and a shy smile, approached her, holding a sketchbook. "I drew this for you," she said, revealing a portrait of Denise, her face fierce and kind, surrounded by words, strength, justice, hope. Denise's eyes stung, and she hugged the girl tightly, her heart full. Back at home, she kept the sketch on her mantle, next to a photo of her mother and a worn Bible. It was a reminder not of the pain, but of the power she'd found, the lives she'd touched, the future she was helping build. Savannah wasn't perfect, would never be. But it was different now, its scars a map of battles fought and won. As spring turned to summer, Denise stood at the edge of Forsyth Park, watching a rally unfold, smaller than the first, but no less passionate. Tasha spoke, her megaphone a beacon, and Jamal, now a local hero, filmed it all, his camera a weapon of truth. Malcolm stood beside Denise, his presence steady, his pride unspoken but palpable. The crowd chanted, their voices rising into the warm air, and Denise felt the pulse of a city, a people, a movement that wouldn't stop. She closed her eyes, the sounds washing over her, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that the world could tilt a little closer to justice. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And Denise Harris, nurse, survivor, fighter, would be there, standing at the center exactly where she was meant to be. So folks, there you have it, Denise Harris, the nurse who walked into a pharmacy for her meds and ended up schooling an entire city on what justice looks like. Can we just take a second to applaud her? I mean, talk about turning lemons into a full-on lemonade empire. But let's get real, Denise's story isn't just a feel-good Netflix special waiting to happen, though, Hollywood, call her. It's a mirror held up to 2025 America, where, let's be honest, we're still dodging the same old traps by sneaking into everyday moments, systems creaking under their own weight, and the occasional Karen thinking she's Judge Judy with a name tag. Here's the kicker, Denise didn't have superpowers unless you count epic patience and a spine of steel. She was just a regular woman tired from a double shift who said enough. And that's the lesson for us, right? You don't need a cape to stand up. Maybe it's calling out that coworker who jokes a bit too much or filming a moment that smells like injustice. Shout out to Jamal and his phone. Small moves can spark big change, like tossing a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples take down a dam. Funny thing is, we all have that pebble in our pocket, we just gotta throw it. Now let's make this personal. Have you ever had a Denise moment? You know, that time you faced something unfair and had to decide. Shrink or shine? Maybe it was at work, school, or even the DMV, because let's face it, that place tests us all. Drop your story in the comments. I'm dying to hear how you threw your pebble. And while you're at it, what's one thing you tell your younger self about standing up for what's right? Let's get this convo popping. Oh, and before you scroll away to binge cat videos, don't sleep on the subscribe button. Hit it to catch more stories like Denise tales of everyday heroes, epic showdowns, and the kind of courage that makes you fist pump the air. Plus, you'll make our channel's algorithm do a happy dance, and who doesn't want that? Join the crew and let's keep shining a light on truth, one story at a time. So what's next, ready to change the world or just your Wi-Fi password? Tell me below.